I don't have any sound on. Good afternoon and welcome to the Eisenhower Presidential Library to our Lunch and Learn. Thank you for joining us. My name is Joy Murphy. I'm the Director of Learning and Engagement here at the Eisenhower. Today we are pleased to welcome Dr. Edward Keefer, who will be speaking with us about Eisenhower and the Korean War Armistice. And take it away, Dr. Keefer.
Okay, before I begin my talk, I'm obliged to make a disclaimer. Here it goes. The views expressed here are my own and do not represent those of the Department of Defense or the U.S. government. All you got is me. Okay. The name of the talk is 5 Decisions, Eisenhower and the End of the Korean War. And let me give you a little historical context. It's now been almost 70 years since the Armistice ended and the ceasefire, which was supposed to be the first step towards peace in Korea. Instead, the two Koreas have remained deadlocked in a time warp confrontation, still technically at war. Now, in July 1953, North and South Korea were in ruins. And over the next 70 years, the South has prospered economically, evolved into a democracy, and has become a cultural force in the world. North Korea remains a cult of personality dictatorship, alone, aggrieved, and with only one major asset, its weapons of mass destruction. Now, when Eisenhower took the oath of office, his priority was to end the Korean War. It was to prove difficult and challenging. And in this talk, I will concentrate on 5 decisions Eisenhower made to end the fighting. Now, not all historians agree on the reasons and motivations that led to the armistice. Now, thanks, however, to research by historians at different international archives, a body of evidence has emerged that seeks to explain the end of the war. And the question is, how significant was Eisenhower's role in that process? And let me add a personal note. As a newly minted PhD back in the 1970s, the Department of State assigned me to assembled a foreign relations volume on Korea, 1952-1954. I came to this library 45 years ago. This is my first time back. I told you I'd come back. I came to know Eisenhower mostly through the extraordinarily candid accounts of the National Security Council meetings. These minutes of then top secret discussions here at the library proved a revelation. Never before had such national security deliberations been so skillfully and fully reported. They were fascinating and sometimes a little scary as Eisenhower and his advisors contemplated military contingencies to end the war. Let's go to the first decision. Eisenhower's first decision was to convince American voters that as a Republican candidate, he could end the fighting. Americans had wearied of the stalemated Korean conflict and the armistice negotiations that had been going on for more than a year. On the advice of his political advisors, Eisenhower promised that if elected, he would go to Korea. Ike was hardly committing himself to much more than a look-see, but his reputation as the organizer of D-Day and World War II Supreme Commander convinced many voters that he was the man to end the war. Their trust transformed his expected victory over Adlai Stevenson into a landslide. So Eisenhower's first decision had been a relatively easy and a very successful one. Now, Eisenhower, as president-elect, traveled to South Korea, but he remained uncommitted to any strategy to end the war. He got within earshot of the battlefield that roughly approximated the 38th parallel, the pre-June 1950 boundary between the two Koreas. He met briefly with the commander of UN forces, General Mark Clark, and then with South Korean President Syngman Rhee. To Clark's disappointment, Eisenhower seemed uninterested in plans for a new military offensive to force the communists to accept an armistice. Now, returning from Korea by ship, Eisenhower and his designated Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, brainstormed over options to end the war, including the use of atomic weapons. In December 1952, the president-elect met with retired General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur recommended a face-to-face meeting with Joseph Stalin, and if the Soviet leader did not agree to a neutralized North and South Korea, MacArthur advised Ike to use a combination of atomic weapons, amphibious landings, remember Incheon, a radioactive barrier at the Yalu River, and the bombing of Chinese military installations along the border with North Korea to force an end to the war. MacArthur's advice was far too dangerous for a cautious Eisenhower. Ike remained undecided and uncommitted, very much keeping his options open. At this point, the president really had no plan to end the war. Now let's go to the second decision that Eisenhower had to make. That was to accept that there was no easy way to end the fighting in Korea. Eisenhower had hoped to devise a military strategy that would force the North Koreans and the Chinese to accept an armistice without escalation to a larger regional conflict. Eisenhower focused on such military strategy at these NSC meetings. He listened, engaged fully in the discussions, and often thought out loud. Initially, he suggested a number of options that would end the war without a UN major offensive to the waist of Korea or an attack on China. For example, Eisenhower suggested targeting the communist front line with tactical atomic weapons. The Joint Chiefs of Staff said, no, you can't do that. They convinced the president that these weapons, tactical nuclear weapons, would be ineffective against communist fortifications. For following Mao's advice to dig deep and store grain, the Chinese and North Koreans had created extensive and deep tunnels and bunkers along the front line. And then remember that the United States had not developed bunker busting bombs, so tactical nuclear weapons would not really dislodge the enemy. Later in the spring of '53, signs pointed toward a possible North Korean-Chinese acceptance of the armistice. Eisenhower suggested a ploy to put final pressure on the communists. He wondered if faking a military buildup, the shades of D-Day deception, might push the enemy to the armistice signing table. Again, the JCS argued that such, quote, psychological pressures, unquote, were not advisable unless Eisenhower was prepared to back them up if the negotiations broke down. Therefore, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the military advisors, poured cold water on Eisenhower's easy ways to end the war. Now, let's move to the third decision that Eisenhower made, and that was what to do if the communist side refused to sign an armistice and continued fighting. Eisenhower came to this decision warily. And the clearest evidence of Eisenhower's caution was his administration's ad hoc and dilatory approach to ending the war strategy. After 3 months in office, Eisenhower finally directed his Secretary of Defense to estimate the cost of a massive blow to reach and hold the waist of Korea and to inflict maximum damage on Chinese and North Korean forces without bombing Manchurian airfields. Eisenhower stated that the use of atomic weapons should depend on the advantage that they provided against the enemy. Another example, in early April '53, Eisenhower asked the NSC Planning Board, which was the sort of strategy of the organization in the White House, to produce options on Korea. And the board prepared 6 courses of action, ranging from fighting the war as Truman had done, to a large-scale offensive, naval blockade, and bombing attacks on China. The board dodged the issue of atomic weapons, indicating they were applicable in all options, but they deferred the decision to the full NSC. Now, this third decision reached its climax at an NSC meeting on May 20th, 1953. Eisenhower agreed that the United States would use atomic weapons if the armistice proved unattainable. Eisenhower specifically noted, for the record, quote unquote, that in the face of communist intransigence at Panmunjom, he would order a ground offensive to the waist of Korea combined with air attacks on China to include atomic weapons. Such a campaign would compel the communists to sign an armistice. Eisenhower naturally worried about possible worldwide nuclear war with the Soviet Union. Importantly, this third decision was still a contingency. It would only happen if the communist side refused to accept an armistice. However, as Eisenhower noted, it had the full force of his pre-approval. Now, the fourth decision that Eisenhower made was to secretly inform the Chinese of this May 20th plan. And on an official visit to India, Secretary of State Dulles passed in oblique terms the so-called atomic threat to Prime Minister Nehru. Dulles believed that the Indian Prime Minister would relay his words to the Chinese in Beijing. Now, the Eisenhower administration also sent covert messages to the Chinese through the Chinese nationalist government on Taiwan and through lower echelons at Panmunjom. In subsequent recollections, both Dulles and Eisenhower claimed that the threat in these messages convinced the Chinese to agree to a UN armistice. And the atomic threat, as it's been known, has been the subject of historical controversy. Was it really the deciding factor for Moscow and Beijing? Historians point out that after the death of Joseph Stalin in March 1953, the Soviet leadership was focused on Kremlin succession. And additionally, popular demonstrations were breaking out in Eastern Europe, which threatened Soviet control there. They argued that the Kremlin leadership had other priorities than continuing to support the costly war in Korea. And perhaps even more importantly, the Chinese and the North Korean side had already agreed to an exchange of sick and wounded prisoners and was well on its way to accepting a face-saving compromise that allowed POWs on both sides to choose to return to the country of their choice. Finally, if the Chinese actually got the message implicit in the atomic threat, and there is some doubt that they did. They were already aware that the United States had and was considering atomic attacks. Eisenhower was not the first president to send such signals. Truman sent feints and hints that he might push the atomic button. And in response, Mao and the Beijing leadership had prepared their defenses accordingly and calculated that China would survive such an attack. So rather than the deciding factor that ended the Korean War, as Eisenhower and Dulles claimed, the atomic threat was one of a series of events that brought the fighting in Korea to a close. Let me go to the fifth decision now. That was to convince ultra-nationalist President Syngman Rhee to accept or at least not sabotage the armistice. Rhee dreamed of a united Korea under his leadership. He threatened to ignore any ceasefire and have the South Korean forces fight on alone. Eisenhower's advisors considered three choices. One, give Rhee a mutual security pact in return for signing an armistice. Two, resurrect a plan called Operation Everready to take Rhee into custody and find a successor willing to sign the armistice. And the third option was to withdraw from Korea. Ike's advisors considered the second and third options too draconian and recommended only the first, and Eisenhower enthusiastically agreed. But before the Eisenhower administration was able to convince Rhee to accept the armistice, the South Korean president attempted to torpedo the armistice negotiations at Panmunjom. In late June 1953, he released 25,000 North Korean POWs under his army's custody. The South Korean guards opened the gates, and the POWs fled and melted into South Korean society. Eisenhower reacted with frustration, anger, and puzzlement at Rhee's brazen action. At an NSC meeting, the president briefly considered withdrawal from Korea and wondered why Rhee seemed bent on national suicide. Then Ike asked for advice. Dulles responded that the release was Rhee's last desperate attempt to prevent an armistice. If Rhee realized this ploy would not work, he would fall into line. And as for the communists, Dulles suspected that they were so anxious for an armistice that they would overlook Rhee's POW release. Eisenhower accepted Dulles' advice, and Dulles proved correct. And I think at this point I should explain why the question of the fate of POWs, US, UN, Korean, and Chinese, had been virtually the only major issue holding up the armistice negotiations. The UN side, of which the United States was the leading factor, insisted on voluntary repatriation, which would allow POWs to decide whether to return to their respective homelands or go elsewhere. The communist side refused to consider anything but repatriation to their own home countries. The official U.S. explanation for what it called voluntary repatriation was that it was a question of liberty and freedom of choice. From the Eisenhower administration's point of view, involuntary repatriation would return Chinese POWs who wanted a better life to a communist servitude. But there was a subtext. In a potential war with the Soviet Union, the precedent of voluntary repatriation would provide a powerful magnet to convince East European Warsaw Pact soldiers to surrender and receive a free ticket to the West. China had its own concerns about POW repatriation. If Chinese POWs chose to return to Taiwan instead of China, Beijing would lose face worldwide. And to make matters worse, most of the Chinese POWs were former Chinese nationalist soldiers forced into the People's Republic Army after the end of the Chinese Civil War. And if allowed to repatriate to Taiwan, they would probably integrate into the Chinese nationalist forces. In the end, the US, UN, and the communist side agreed on a compromise. Under the supervision of a neutral nations commission, agents of their respective countries would interview the POWs refusing to repatriate. Those still insisted on returning home were not compelled to do so. Once the POW repatriation issue had been resolved, Rhee was the only obstacle to peace. Eisenhower considered Rhee's pledge to fight on blackmail, but he agreed to a plan to try to win Rhee over. Eisenhower sent a personal representative to Seoul to reason with Rhee. He encouraged South Korean supporters in the Congress to send Rhee's letters urging him to sign the armistice. While Ike accepted that the United States could not leave Korea, he was prepared to imply that it might. The administration proceeded with a two-track policy of planting seeds of doubt about U.S. intentions, as well as continuing to negotiate for Rhee's cooperation. The hints that the United States might leave Korea were hardly believable. They were really just an idle threat. So really, Rhee had to be won over by concessions. After many concessions and a promise that the United States Senate would ratify the U.S.-South Korean Mutual Security Pact, Rhee relented. Finally, with an armful of concessions in his hands, Rhee agreed not to obstruct the settlement at Panmunjom. When the United States Command and North Korea signed the armistice on July 27, 1953, no Republic of Korea representative's signature was on it. While we had agreed to accept the terms of the armistice, he was damned if he was going to allow South Korea to sign it. After July 27th, the UN issued a version of the warning that Dulles had passed Nehru. If the communists resumed the fighting, the U.S. would respond with a greater effort and would not restrict the battle to the Korean Peninsula. Let me review now the 5 decisions that Korea made. First, he convinced the American voters that he could do it. However, once in office, the president did not have a clear idea how to proceed, and he and his advisors thrashed around for 4 months discussing the problem and considering options. Second, Eisenhower had to accept that there was no easy way to end the fighting, and the Joint Chiefs were very important in convincing him of this fact. Third, he decided that if the communists refused to sign an armistice, he would inaugurate a ground offensive to the west of Korea and carry the fight to China with atomic bombs. Fourth, he sent messages to the Chinese that he would use atomic weapons if they remained intransigent at Panmunjom. And fifth, he cajoled and enticed Rhee to accept the armistice and forego his dream of a reunified Korea. During those 7 months that Eisenhower grappled with the Korean War, he was not as decisive or masterful as early biographers have claimed. Ending the fighting proved difficult and frustrating. The administration had multiple false starts and setbacks. Nevertheless, Eisenhower proved an involved chief executive and commander-in-chief. He was an active and engaged decision maker. Even more importantly, Eisenhower listened to advice that often went against his first instincts. Nor was Eisenhower the avuncular Ike etched in the public mind. He was quick to anger and could become rattled. He often vented his frustration at high-level meetings, but in the end, his decisions reflected his reservoir of common sense. He relied on the advice of a few elite advisors, but he considered their recommendations based on the inherent understanding of the horrors of war and the American public's tolerance for continuing fighting in Korea. Eisenhower and Dulles may have believed that their atomic threat to China ended the fighting. I think a deeper understanding of Chinese and Soviet leadership and societies indicates that the threat was only one of a number of factors coalescing to end the fighting. While Eisenhower's 5 decisions alone did not end the Korean War, they played an integral and crucial part in the process. And for that, Eisenhower deserves full credit. Thank you.
Hang on one second. There she is. Yep, she's back.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Keefer. If you are in our virtual space, feel free to start typing your questions in the chat. And there are people in person, if you have questions, and now would be the time. You can stand up and use the microphone, please. Or you can write your questions down and hand it to William, who is in the room, and he'll ask your questions for you. In the meantime, I will say thank you, Dr. Keefer. Our topic or theme for the year is difficult decisions. And so I like that you said right there at the end that ending the fight was difficult and frustrating for President Eisenhower. And if there's any way for you to expound on that, outside of what you've already done, in regards to our theme about having to make difficult decisions as a president or within his administration.
I'm having a little trouble understanding the question because,
Joy, could you repeat the question a little louder, please?
Can you give me a second shot at that question, please? Oh. Well, how about some of the other questions?
Yeah, do we have any other questions in the audience? Any questions while we're waiting to get Joy connected?
What was the time frame of this whole process then?
Would you use the mic, please?
What was the time frame for this whole process?
Eisenhower, before Eisenhower even ran for president, he obviously the Korean War was on his mind. Officially, he took office on January 20th, 1953. But before that, as I pointed out, he'd been talking with people about how to end the Korean War. But then they had 7 long months where everything seemed to go wrong, including communists would endlessly refuse to negotiate, would argue endlessly, over minor details at the talks at Panmunjom. Rhee was trying to destroy the Armistice by releasing his POWs, North Korean POWs. So Eisenhower had a very long and frustrating time. And of course, Korea wasn't the only thing he had to deal with. Presidents have multiple issues. But I think it's fair to say that Korea was most on his mind because of his promise to end the war in Korea. Any other
questions? Okay. All right, we'll give Joy another
Any
shot.
questions from the World Wide Web?
No, I think that Joy will.
Can you hear me clearly now?
Joy, it's a little muffled, Joy, but you're louder. There we go. Try again.
Can you hear me now?
Whoa. Very loudly. We got you. Try again.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes, you can. I don't know what to do. I'm not hearing him. Oh, he's on. Can you text William? Mm-hmm. Let's go. Okay. You hear me now?
Yep.
Okay. There are questions in the chat, and one of them says, "How was Ike able to sell the armistice to the pro-war faction, and how big of an influence did this have for him to give his military-industrial complex speech?"
You get that?
Okay, there we go.
Well, here's what I'm going to do.
How was Ike able to sell the armistice? How was Ike able to sell the armistice to the pro-war faction?
How was he able to sell the armistice to the pro-war faction?
And how big of an influence did this have for him to give his military-industrial complex speech?
Well, I think Eisenhower correctly believed that the vast majority of Americans were sick to death of the war in Korea. It was, I remember the old, why die for a tie? It was big.
Right, and that's what he's answering.
So I think the hardliners like MacArthur were a faction, but they didn't represent, I think, the most of the Republican Party, and they certainly didn't represent the American public. The war in Korea, I was actually alive during the war in Korea. I imagine some people here were too. It was a long and frustrating experience for everyone. So I think Eisenhower was able to realize this and was confident that he could end the war without a lot of blowback from hardline conservatives. Let me give you one anecdote. I don't know whether you'll be interested or not, but when I came to do research in this library, the so-called NSC minutes, and the NSC, of course, is the major national security organization. It's made up of the Secretary of Defense, Secretary of State, the President, the Vice President, and a few other people. And they really deliberate policy decisions about national security. And we did not know that there were the verbatim records of these meetings. And when we read them, we were amazed. They were done by an historian, S. Everett Gleason, who really caught the essence of this and understood the discussions. And as I said, when we were reading them, it was fascinating, but also a little scary. And initially, we tried to get these records declassified, and the government said, well, these are private conversations. We should never release NSC records. Somehow we managed to convince them to release them. And subsequently, most administrations have had these records. None as good as the Eisenhower Library's records, but certainly similar. And the precedent has been created that eventually, after 30-something years, the records of the National Security Council will be released. And they are a gold mine if you're interested in national security decisions. Any other questions?
One more from online from the library. Our theme for the year is difficult decisions. At the end of your speech, you stated that ending the fight was both difficult and frustrating. Can you expound on this? Was it difficult to make in terms of going against what Eisenhower was trained to do, or because he disagreed with his advisors, or for some other reason?
Okay, can you just quickly repeat what you question? I'm still not.
Sure. I'll try again, or we'll ignore the mic. Our theme for the year is difficult decisions.
Right.
At the end of your speech, you stated that ending the fight was both difficult and frustrating. Can you expound on this?
Okay. Well, remember that the war started in June of 1950, and it wasn't until 1951 that the actual negotiations to end the war began. And so throughout the last part of the Truman administration, there were these talks going on, but they were going nowhere. And so that Eisenhower came to essentially a stalemate, and he had to come up with a way to end the Korean War, and he had to make some tough decisions. Perhaps the toughest decision was, of course, to use nuclear weapons if he had to, but it was only if he had to. Eisenhower was he was not a warmonger, obviously. He didn't want to use nuclear weapons. He did think out loud at these NSC meetings, sort of throwing out suggestions. And when you read those suggestions, you get a little bit nervous. You say, geez, is he really serious? But you have to remember that Eisenhower was a man who thought aloud and was able to sort of throw out suggestions and see how people reacted to them, how his advisors reacted to them. So that was perhaps his most difficult decision, because that really could have created at least a regional atomic nuclear war, or even a worldwide nuclear war. Of course, the nuclear weapons were smaller, they were delivered by planes, it wasn't the same as it is today. And remember, tactical nuclear weapons are very low yield. They're not like even the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima or Nagasaki. And I think perhaps the best decision Eisenhower made was to convince Rhee to sign the Armistice. That was a combination of cajoling, promises, and Rhee's behavior was so outrageous that Eisenhower could have just thrown up his hands and said, either let's get rid of this guy or let's get out of Korea. But he didn't. But he patiently worked through various stratagems to get Rhee to agree. So I see another question back there.
What was the combined total of debt of U.S. military in the Korean War?
You want casualty figures? I think 53 Americans died. 53,000 Americans died. Is that correct? The trouble with there's no real figure for North Koreans and South Koreans because so many civilians, but we're talking about millions. And we're talking about a war that really reduced both Koreas to rubble. And the extraordinary thing, to me at least, is how the South Koreans have emerged from this horrible experience and have prospered and expanded their influence worldwide, held Olympic Games, become a democracy, and how the North Koreans have just retreated into their shell. And of course, the North Koreans took a tremendous amount of casualties too. And remember, the Chinese came in as volunteers, but they really, by the end of the war, they were doing the major fighting. They were taking a lot of casualties.
Well, Joy has let us know that there are no more online questions at the moment. Does anyone else in the room have any questions for Dr. Keefer?
There are no more questions that I see online.
Oh, we do have one more. Sorry. Joy, can you type that, please? Go ahead, Ann.
What was Rhee's motivation? Was he just so focused on unification, or was he a little mentally unbalanced?
Rhee was a long-time Korean nationalist. I think he went to the remember Korea before World War II, Korea was under Japanese colonial rule. And Rhee was an anti-colonial agitator. And I think he went to the Paris Peace Talks and tried to get the participants there to do a resolution about Korean independence, but he failed. So he'd been a long time advocate of Korean independence, and his view of Korean independence was the whole Korean peninsula. Under his, well, eventually he became the sort of natural president when he was elected by a fairly fair, not totally fair election, but he was elected president of South Korea. But his dream was a unified Korea, and a dream that has not happened and may never happen. So, but he was I think he was a legitimate nationalist, but he sort of, by the end of the war, I think he lost slightly his sense of perspective. Anyone who thought that the South Koreans could fight on alone and eventually win this war was crazy. It wasn't going to happen. And I think that's what Eisenhower was realized. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Keefer.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Keefer, for coming. Thank you all who are in the building for joining us. Thank you to everyone who is online for joining us. We really appreciate it. We have just a few announcements that we'd like to make before we end the program.
Oh, well, yeah.
So thank you to, our 2022 public program that's on the screen. Next month we have, what's next month? Okay, so next month we just have our lunch and learn, which will be on the 4th Thursday at noon. We will both be virtual and in person.
Larry Kai, Ike and Joe, the best of it.
Thank you. Our speakers, Larry Kai, and our topic is I Can Joe, the Best of Enemy. And then in June, we have a lunch and learn and an evenings at ease. Both of those speakers will be in person. So you are welcome to come out for our evenings at ease and our lunch and learn. And both topics for the month will be on the civil rights movement. So please join us for that. And we want to thank the Jeffcoat Foundation and the Eisenhower Foundation for their support. Without their generous support, we would not be able to put on these programs for you. So thank you again and have a wonderful afternoon.